The late afternoon sun had that tired honey light that made the highway shimmer as if the asphalt were a slow river. Heat rose in visible waves from the guardrail, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline, cut grass, and the distant bakery on Route 9, where a faint scent of cinnamon and butter lingered on the breeze. I sat on the gravel, the hem of my skirt collecting small pinpricks of dust, and watched my son walk to his truck with a stiffness I had not seen in him since he was a boy learning to ride without training wheels. He shut the door without looking back, and the engine started like a finality. He leaned on the horn for a single, loud beat as if sounding an end, and then he drove away, leaving me with a handful of folded receipts and a wallet that held precisely $11 and a bus card I had not used since the city changed the fare machines. The radio in a passing car played a song I used to hear on the radio when he was small, and it felt like an insult and a comfort at the same time. We had argued about money and memory and mortgage conversations that sounded more like mathematics than family. He had spoken in a tone that tried to be kind, but landed as a verdict. "Mom, you cannot keep insisting that you remember everything. It is dangerous," he had said, with that exhausted patience people use when they are closing a file. I had answered with half the fierceness left in me, and the other half of me, the tired part, simply wanted someone to listen. "I am not a problem to be scheduled," I said. He looked at me as if he had been given a household appliance that had suddenly stopped working and needed replacing. The slam of the car door felt like a sentence served. I checked my phone, 12%, and the battery icon blinked with a judgmental red sliver that seemed to represent all the warnings I had been ignoring. I unfastened the strap of my bag and found the small bottle of pills I kept for bad nights and the receipt for a taxi I had not taken. My hands smelled faintly of lemon soap, the one Elena next door sent me for my birthday last year. The sun lay heavy on my shoulders, and for an instant every sound sharpened. The flurry of crows in the telephone wires, the distant murmur of tires on concrete, someone laughing in a yard across the road. I folded the receipts and tried to fold myself into something smaller, less troublesome. Then a car pulled up behind the truck, the tires whispering against gravel. He got out. He moved like a man who had rehearsed courtesy and seen it work on many stages. He wore a pale linen jacket despite the heat, a hat that belonged to another era, and sunglasses that reflected the sky in a soft, unreadable blue. He carried, oddly, a small leather case the size of a lunchbox, and his shoes were the kind polished that suggested meetings and long drives. There was a cane leaning against the truck bed, a slender white thing with a brass nugget on the top that gleamed like a small coin. He approached in a way that filled the space without taking it like a footprint on a clean floor. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice slid into the afternoon like oil. It did not rush me. "Are you all right? You look like someone who was left waiting at a station." I tried to say no, a reflexive "no, I'm fine," but the throat betrayed me, and instead a small laugh, embarrassed and wet, escaped. "My son," I said, he said I should go back to the city, said it would be better for me." He nodded as if this were a common human pattern. He put down the leather case and sat on the low stone wall near me. Up close, his skin had the faint map of sun and kindness. His eyes, when he removed the glasses to wipe a smudge, were a gray like old paper. "If you would do me a curious favor, would you?" he asked. "Would you pretend you are my mother for a few minutes? My driver will be here in 5, and I need someone to call me Marcus for a moment. It will allow me to explain something to him without any awkwardness. Your son will be fine. He will be all right." The request was absurd, and because I had been reduced to absurdities, almost sensible. I thought of the bus schedule, of the smallness of $11, of how the day had folded me into corners I'd not occupied. The man smelled faintly of cedar and lemon oil. His cane had, I noticed, a tiny chip, as if it had been used to tap a rhythm on a table. I hesitated, fingers in my lap, and weighed the small pieces of my dignity against the possibility of a lift and perhaps a cup of tea. "Why me?" I asked. "Why my son and not someone younger?" He smiled, and his cheeks made an honest crease. "Because you look like someone who remembers names and knows how to say them in the right way," he said. "And because sometimes it helps the driver to put people where they expect them to be. It makes the world run smoother for 5 minutes." I thought of the way my son had said, "You cannot keep insisting," and how that phrasing had sounded like an embargo. I thought of the way the world had begun to feel like a ledger. I thought of my slippers in the hall and a kettle in my small kitchen that still knew how to whistle despite everything. The man extended his hand. "Come, tea with me," he said. "Sit for tea. If after that you still want to walk home, I will pay for a cab and I will make sure you get there. No tricks." So I took his hand. The leather of his palm was warm and calloused in a way that mapped years of use. When I stood, the gravel crunched under my shoes, and a car in the distance coughed. The man removed his hat and bowed his head like a man offering a private benediction. "My name is Jonas," he said. "Please call me Jonas." We walked to his car. It smelled of cedar and leather. The driver was leaning against the hood, a silent man with a neat beard and a badge glinting at his belt. He nodded once and slipped into the driver's seat. The car door closed with a soft click that sounded like the end of the afternoon. As the car glided away, the hum of the engine and the whoosh of air conditioning wrapped around me like a cloak. I felt my son's truck become a small toy in the mirror, and for the first time that day, something like curiosity stirred. Inside Jonas's house, the air carried a faint scent of books and lemon peel. The walls had a careful array of photographs, some black and white, some with a sepia tone, scenes of parties and museums and long dining tables. The furniture was the kind that looked as if it had always belonged to the room, like chairs that remember who sat in them. He guided me to a sunroom where light came filtered through gauzy curtains and where a kettle hummed on a small stove. There was the sound of cutlery on porcelain in the next room and a cat that rubbed itself against the leg of Jonas's trousers with an approving purr. "Key?" he asked. "Please," I said, and meant it in a way that was larger than the word. We sat. He poured carefully, his hands steady. The porcelain warmed my palms. The tea tasted faintly of bergamot and something green and raw that woke me. I noticed small inconsistencies in the house. There was a painting in the hall that showed a coastline I recognized from summers decades ago, and yet, on a shelf nearby, there was an award in a glass case with the word foundation engraved in a solemn script. On the mantel sat a small bronze statue of a woman holding a torch, and beside it a stack of correspondence with letterheads from cultural institutions. "Tell me why you were at the highway," Jonas said after a while. His voice was not prying so much as patient, like a slow clock. I told him. I told him about Mark, about how he had begun to speak to me in terms of schedules and checklists, about the day my sister had stopped calling because she said my calls had become long and repetitive. I told him about the mortgage, about the small rebellions I kept hidden in the back of the freezer, about the way I sometimes left the lights on all night to convince myself the house was awake with me. As I spoke, the room seemed to contract like a listening audience. When I finished, Jonas asked questions that were specific but never cruel, the kind that picked a lock gently. He told me his own stories in return over the course of the afternoon. He had been involved, he said, in preserving old theaters and had once run a small foundation that supported retired craftspeople. He mentioned a daughter named Clara who lived in another state and worked in urban planning, and he brought up a chauffeur named Miguel who had been with him for 8 years and who was fiercely loyal. Jonas had the air of someone used to being curated by the press and then left alone on evenings. His backstory unfolded like a well-edited documentary. Childhood in a port town, training in restoration, a marriage that ended with a long, slow agreement of dividing houses and libraries, a present where he lived half in the public eye and half in quiet rooms. His words painted a life that held dignity, facade, and a string of minor embarrassments. He spoke of autonomy as both a right and a precarious thing, like glass that glittered but might cut if handled wrong. Over the course of that first visit, Jonas introduced me to people whose names would later stitch themselves into the fabric of my life. There was Miguel, the driver, who had hands that smelled of engine oil and rosemary. There was Elsa, a trustee from the foundation, who had a laugh like a bell and who insisted on making sure my teacup was never empty. There was Rachel, a journalist I would later meet under less friendly circumstances, who at that moment visited as a friend of Jonas's daughter, carrying a stack of newspapers and a curious expression. There was Henry, a solicitor, whose voice made long words into soft ropes and who would advise us in moments of public stress. There was Sophie, a neighbor from Jonas's block who owned a flower shop and who loved restoring old lamps. There was Elena from my street, who came bringing lemon bars and who would later lobby the neighborhood association on my behalf. Finally, there was Daniel, an organizer at a cultural hall that Jonas supported, who possessed a punctual and calming straightness. The first evening stretched into a series of small conversations and longer dinners where the topics circled slowly like a moth to a lamp. The dialogues were long and layered. At dinner, Jonas and I exchanged close to a dozen verbal turns, each one doing the work of the previous, probing, reassuring, arguing, and then making up with a laugh. "You cannot go back in time," he said at one point, "but you can name the things you refuse to lose." "I refuse to lose my voice," I said. "Not entirely." He studied me and then said something that would grow and contract like a rumor in my head. "There are ways to make sure voices are heard," he said. "There are projects I fund, a small foundation that supports people like you to tell their stories to the city. It is not grandeur. It is tables and microphones and simple listening posts. It is bureaucratic and slow, and it also changes things." Sophie, whose hands smelled of dirt from pruning roses, leaned in and said gently, "If you would like, we could host a small evening. People bring small things, memories, and speak into a microphone. No cameras, just presence." The sensory life of those evenings is what I remembered most vividly later. The china warmed by hands, the scrape of a spoon against porcelain, the must of old paper when Jonas took a journal from the shelf, the softness of a shawl draped across my lap that smelled faintly of lavender, the distant toot of a train, the glow of a lamp that made everyone's faces both kinder and more merciless. There were moments when the house felt like a harbor and moments when it felt like a stage. Then came the first public event, a gala at the town's renovated cultural hall, where Jonas's foundation had contributed toward a restoration. It was the kind of night that exposes facades and reveals them. The hall had been lit with low lamps, and the air tasted of champagne and lemon canapes. I wore a dress that Elena had recommended and felt like I had been dressed up for a portrait. The photographs that night would later circulate with tight captions: "Elderly woman, guest at gala, supported by benefactor." None of the captions contained the smell of lemon bars or the awkward tenderness of handshakes. At the gala, there were toasts and quiet, 3-minute speeches about legacy and dignity. Rachel was there in her capacity as a cultural reporter, taking notes with a pen that clicked with the rhythm of a metronome. Daniel introduced me from the stage with a phrase about voices long ignored. And the audience clapped in that way audiences clap when they have received a performance they have rehearsed to appreciate. The event was, in public, charming. Behind the curtains, in private, a journalist's curiosity can become a blade. I had been living, lately, already half described in third person, and the official language of the evening was both flattering and distant. After the gala, an article appeared in a regional paper that took an odd turn. What was meant to be a human interest piece became an inquiry. Rachel's article lingered on Jonas's past partnerships and questioned the management of funds. It quoted a former trustee with a grudge who suggested that the foundation liked to collect faces for fundraising events and then move on. The tone shifted from admiration to suspicion in 2 column inches. I read it on my porch under a lamp that rendered the headlines like copper. The house smelled of cut flowers left over from the gala and of burning toast negligently made. That night, I felt a tension like the band of a drum tightened too far. Jonas called as soon as I had read the headline. He spoke quickly, with the crisp efficiency of someone used to crisis. "We will respond," he said. "There are lines we can run. There are statements, calm and factual. We will meet with Henry and we will craft a response. We will not let this become a smear." We met with Henry in Jonas's study, a room where books leaned like old friends. Henry explained the legal steps in a steady voice. He described an initial press release that would outline transparency measures and an offer to release audited accounts. He detailed the procedural requirements for a foundation's compliance review, naming the filings and the timeline in careful sentences. The technical description of the process landed like a map. An initial release, followed by third-party audits, followed by the possibility of a formal inquiry if any irregularities were found. He also advised caution, suggesting that certain defenses could sound defensive and heighten suspicion. That explanation filled just under 300 words and contained, in the steady way legal language does, both threat and comfort. Despite Henry's calm, a different kind of crisis began to gnaw at me. People I had known in my neighborhood started to ask questions in tentative voices. "Is she part of a plan?" they would whisper at the grocery store. Elena brought lemon tarts and left them at the door with a note that said in block capitals, "We are with you." My son called twice, first with an awkward apology that sounded more like a negotiation, and later with silence. Jonas's behavior in public shifted. He became carefully measured, like a man who had been instructed in how to be invisible when necessary. There were private confrontations that lasted long into evenings. Jonas and I argued in the garden behind his house with voices that rose and fell in waves. "You have to understand what it looks like," I said, standing under a tree whose leaves whispered with a summer breeze. He countered with facts and the names of people who would vouch for the foundation's accounting. "I never asked you to be my shield," he said at one point, "but I asked you to be with me." "You asked me to pretend to be your mother," I said. "You asked me to take a place, and then you expected me not to notice when people moved pieces on the board." The dialogues in that period were taut and long. We measured each other's words like crimes or confessions. When Rachel's second piece came out, more pointed and including a line from an anonymous source alleging preferential grants, the tension reconfigured into a palpable fear. The foundation's board began a formal meeting in which trustees argued about optics and ethics. In that room, I was introduced as a friend of the foundation, a beneficiary of its listening evenings. The minutes from that board would later be referenced in articles and in a small legal file that smelled faintly of copier toner. There were moments of private doubt that felt like storms. Once, on a rainy morning, I caught my reflection in the window and did not recognize the woman looking back. The face was my own, and yet the eyes had collected an edge of suspicion. I remembered lying awake some nights and rehearsing conversations with my son that had never happened. I woke with tears and with lists of things I might apologize for. Those moments were 500 to 600 characters each in the way they compressed into sharp, clean snapshots in my mind. The scent of old lemons, a faint smear of lipstick on a cup, the echo of the gala hall, the hum of a refrigerator like a distant radio. As the public inquiry gained momentum, Rachel contacted me directly, offering an interview. The conversation began cautiously with her recording device running. "Why did you say yes when he asked you to pretend?" she asked. "Were you aware of the possible implications?" We talked for a long time. I told her about the way his offer had felt like a lifeline that day on the highway, about the dryness of my son's eyes when he said, "It is better this way." I described the tea and the lemon oil and the generosity of Sophie, the quiet competence of Miguel the driver, the way Jonas's hands remembered how to hold a teacup. I confessed my pride and my fear, and how sometimes dignity means accepting help you did not ask for. The interview moved beyond the surface. At one point, our conversation became a series of checks and balances. "Do you want this to be public?" Rachel asked. "Do you understand you could be used as a symbol?" I thought of the small evenings in the sunroom where people spoke and were spoken to and felt both heard and small. "I want to be heard," I said. "If that means being used, then too small a price if it opens a door. But I will not be a prop." Her piece, when it came out, was more nuanced. It presented me as a protagonist who had agency and who made a deliberate choice in a moment of vulnerability. It also included troubling quotes from anonymous sources that suggested a pattern of obfuscation. The article lit a fuse in the town. People began to choose sides. Donations were halted pending clarification. The foundation's board called an emergency meeting. Jonas's phone rang and did not stop. The pressure mounted, and we moved into a phase where the decision was no longer private. Jonas called a press conference. He wanted to be transparent. Henry urged a carefully worded statement. Rachel arrived and took a seat in the front row with a notebook. Daniel stood at the side, steady as a pillar. The conference room smelled of disinfectant and coffee. Jonas stood behind the podium, his face lit like a small stage, and spoke about autonomy, dignity, and the foundation's commitment to the truth. The words were clean and purposeful. After the conference, the journalists' questions came like a staccato. Someone asked about preferential grants. Someone else asked about the origins of the anonymous tip. Jonas answered with the kind of openness that did not admit fault but bowed to the need for clarity. "We will cooperate fully with any inquiry," he said. "We have nothing to hide." But the impression had already altered. My son called and left a message that contained, finally, an apology that was less a demand than a bridge. "I did not understand," he said. "I was scared." I listened to the recording twice and then 3 times, tracing the edges of the syllables like a map. There were procedural descriptions that arrived formally, letters from a regulatory body requesting documents and clarifications. The technical explanation of how a compliance review works included the timeline for document submission, the categories investigators review, and the sorts of remedial steps possible if discrepancies arise. It read as a series of steps: initial document request, audit schedules, potential recommendation of governance reforms, and the public notice that would follow any formal findings. That procedural description was precise and stripped of rhetoric, and in it I found both the scaffolding of accountability and the blunt truth that systems move slowly while reputations break quickly. Amid all of this, there were tender, ordinary moments that continued to pull me towards something steadier. Miguel brought over a vase of flowers with a note that read, "For clarity and courage." Sophie sent me a hand-knitted scarf. Elena from my block stopped by with a casserole and sat with me on the porch while we watched the street. These small gestures were the real currency I had not known I needed, the soft touch of someone who will be present whether headlines are kind or cruel. Then, in a private conversation in the kitchen late one night when the house was quiet and stars leaked like salt through the curtains, Jonas said to me quietly, "I sparked this because I forgot how to be small with people. I built structures, and then I neglected the people who make them be worth anything." He looked at me with tired candor. I asked you to step into a role to help me explain something to my driver. I then realized how easily systems can turn people into symbols. For that, I am sorry. We had a long exchange that night, more than 10 rounds of back and forth, where we traced accountability and complicity. He pressed the space between his fingers as if measuring weight. "What matters to you now?" he asked. "My voice," I said. "My autonomy." He nodded. "We will make the accounting public, and I will step aside while it is reviewed. I will also fund a small project for neighbors to hold public listening nights, free and open to all. I will not be invisible in the answer, but I will not be the face either. I will create structures that do not rely solely on my name." The negotiation of public identity was a new form of intimacy. There was a crucial moment when the foundation issued a written pledge to establish an independent committee and to open their ledgers to a third-party audit. The documents were laid out on a table, and Henry walked us through them with the precision of someone folding a map. We signed. The process of making things official felt like pressing seams closed. It was procedural and prosaic, and it felt like a promise. The months that followed were an education in how reputations are mended and how they are not. 1 month later, the neighborhood had more cautious smiles. The listening nights resumed under new oversight with a rotating panel. The project that Jonas funded had a modest beginning but a steady heartbeat. People who had been suspicious showed up, some because they were curious and some because they had an old story they wanted to tell. The first monthly meeting hosted 22 people. There was a woman who read a letter she had never sent to a father, and a man who played a song on a battered guitar. I found my voice again in short, rehearsed turns. I learned how to introduce someone and how to hold silence. I walked past the place where my son had left me and did not flinch. 3 months later, the audit report was released. It found small lapses in record keeping, but no deliberate malfeasance. The press wrote about transparency and the slow recovery of trust. Donations resumed at a modest pace. Jonas stepped back from public speaking and began meeting with community organizers in quiet rooms. He volunteered to fund scholarships to restoration apprenticeships and to underwrite small events without attaching his name prominently. People began to call the project by its mission rather than by the man who funded it. 6 months on, things had altered enough to feel like a new landscape. The listening nights had become a small program recognized by the city council. My relationship with my son had shifted into fragments of repair. He called more often and sometimes visited with a dish he had learned to make, to show he had been paying attention to the smaller details of life. Elena and Sophie continued their regular visits. Rachel wrote an article that read as an epilogue to the scandal rather than the opening. The foundation published its accounts, and a few modest reforms were implemented. I had begun to lead a small group that taught people how to tell short personal stories in 3 minutes and how to listen each time someone did. What began on the side of the road as humiliation transformed into a sequence of small decisions, public scrutiny, and eventual repair. The stranger who had asked me to pretend had opened a door, and through that door a corridor of choices unfurled. Along the way, I named practical steps I would take to protect my autonomy: recurring meetings with a social worker to help manage finances, a small lockbox for important papers, and a written plan for my son to consult rather than decide. These actions were not dramatic, but they were steady. If you felt, while listening, the same mingling of shame and relief that I did in that first afternoon, you are not alone. Have you ever accepted help from a near stranger in a moment of need? Did you say yes because you were tired or because you trusted the gesture? Tell us in one sentence, "I accepted because," or "I refused because." Your comment might be the small ember that helps someone else see a path. Now let us continue, and I will tell you what happened when the public pressure reached its peak and why the choice to speak openly ended up changing how people in our town saw dignity and legacy. In public, the final reckoning came down to a meeting at the community hall, where trustees, journalists, and townspeople filled folding chairs like scores waiting to be read. Rachel moderated a panel that included Henry in a legal capacity, Daniel representing the cultural center, and Elsa from the board. There were questions that cut and others that comforted. The language of ethics joined with the language of everyday need. How do you balance generosity with accountability? Someone asked. Jonas answered with a sentence I remembered because it was both humble and precise. By making sure the structures can survive me, he said. Generosity anchored to a name is fragile. Generosity anchored to governance can last. The board implemented a set of reforms that included rotating trustees, transparent grant processes, and a commitment to a local advisory panel. The town responded with a measured curiosity and a slow return to normal. My son came to one listening night and sat in the back and left before the questions began. He later apologized in person in a way that was neither theatrical nor stilted. I have been learning, he said. I had thought I was protecting you by deciding for you. I see that I was taking away your voice. The project that Jonas helped create became, over time, a small foundation with a different name and a broad mission. It would sponsor apprenticeships in historic trades and host listening nights in community centers. Jonas never sought the spotlight again. He attended occasionally but preferred to make decisions in the quiet rooms. I continued to sit on an advisory panel and taught a class on how to tell 3-minute stories. Small things mattered. A letter of thanks from a woman who had been estranged from her daughter and attended a listening night. A grant that funded a local apprentice who repaired chairs in the old theater. The modest resume of small triumphs that added up. 1 year after that highway afternoon, the town opened a small plaque in the restored hall honoring community voices. My name was not on it. Jonas's name was not on it either. The plaque celebrated the project and those who participated, and my presence there felt like a final, secret kind of vindication. My son and I shared a quiet cup of tea afterward in a cafe that smelled of yeast and citrus. He touched my hand and said, "You were right to want to be heard." I smiled and thought of the gravel, of the $11, and of the stranger with the cane who asked a favor that began an unexpected ledger of change. Being seen is, in its plainest form, freedom. If this story moved you, subscribe for more narratives about ordinary people who are asked to make small, brave choices and who end up remaking the rules. Thank you for listening.